So by popular request today we are going through the worst to best arcade conversions of Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja. I always call this game Dragon Ninja personally, a little bit of a mouthful to say everything in one go. This awesome side-scrolling beat 'em up comes with a fairly generic story where President Ronnie is kidnapped, very clearly named after Ronald Reagan, who was the American president at the time of this game's release. Maybe the ninjas didn't think much of his Reaganomics, who knows. In the game we play as a bad dude and take on ninjas as we travel from New York to truck top fights and beyond. Totally 1980s action-packed style. A game that I had on my Commodore 64 and Nintendo NES back in the day. I had the Commodore 64 version on the Hit Squad label, and it was a game on the C64 that I played a lot of. It even featured in one of my favourite Steve Martin films, which was Parenthood. Classic stuff. So anyways, let's take on those ports as always and see which I personally regard as the most faithful game to the original Data East 1988 arcade game. Now this game should have been titled Bad Apples, as in this is bad, and I don't mean that in a good way either. This pitiful Quicksilver release for the Apple II computers is the miniature version of Bad Dudes, which suffers from insane difficulty like you wouldn't believe. I must have had 10 attempts with this trying to get to the first boss. Needless to say, I just gave up and called it a night. Why is this version so difficult? I honestly have no idea. A possibility is that the game wasn't finished and so made it extremely difficult, hoping that kids would never notice. Now, like I always say with Apple II games, this is a 1977 computer, with this release being in 1989. I will always say then that the audience was still there for this dated machine back in 1989 obviously. This is the very bare basics of the game, features no music and doesn't multi-scroll, which is common for Apple II ports. Just look at RoboCop I uploaded the other day. Regardless, surely this system wasn't up for the task. I am confident that this is Apple II's version of Dark Souls. Very challenging stuff. We are now entering ZX Spectrum Monochrome Gaming. Okay, so where do I start with this? Not necessarily a bad conversion by Ocean, but sometimes, most of the time, 8-bit microcomputers do need to chill out and face the fact that not everything will be included in home conversions. And of course, the Spectrum is no exception here. It controls well enough for sure. I did find collision detection to be a little sporadic at times, especially on the first boss. No music, just sound effects. But to be fair, before the game begins, we have actually got a fair introduction music piece blasting out of the 128K model. No truck midway into stage 1, but I was actually surprised to see that stage 2 performed fairly decently. A fully scrolling stage on top of the truck, that is. No cars dropping off ninja, so something noticeable here is that the coder didn't want to add Data East on the lorry. Instead we see Ocean. Wow, what a set out. The IBM PC compatible DOS conversion actually isn't as bad as I thought it might be. Is it much like the arcades game? Well, yes, it's certainly recognisable at least. It controls fairly well, playing it through as a one player, and oddly enough the beeper sounds really aren't that bad here. Still terrible of course, but for an 80s DOS game this doesn't drive a man insane surprisingly. Visually it looks like a DOS game for sure, and I was a little annoyed of how midway into the first stage that the truck that drives in is actually missing here. As a kid, looking at this game in magazines always portrayed every version of it as having that truck, and it actually wasn't here with the DOS version. Proper action stuff going on for sure. We also had to wait for the disc to load before we get to the first boss. Not really a bad conversion of Bad Dudes, just not great compared to with the other releases to come. This is the version I used to play when I was a kid, and good lord, I didn't appreciate how difficult this was, and fair play to myself for actually beating this C64 conversion once. Now, this was a tough decision between this platform and the next platform. Why? Well, because firstly, although the music by Jonathan Dunn is pretty damn good, we are looking for the next spin to the arcade version, as I always say, and this music wasn't in the arcade original. We also see no truck driving through. On the plus side, we of course get a full screen here, and it really does look the part too with its colours used. Second stage in, we also get no cars, which is dropping off ninjas to fight you on top of the truck. Really though, as great as this port is compared with others, this is a type of game which earned old games a reputation of being hard as nails. A fairly decent 1989 Ocean version for Amstrad CPC owners. If you had a 128k Amstrad model, you would have even had voice synth, to which admittedly sounds almost similar to the arcade game. The game itself scrolls really nicely, fairly good collision detection, and sprites don't give us any flickering when too much is happening on the screen at once. No music, but some sound effects that sounds pretty good. I was happy to see my truck ride through this version too. I love the use of colours here, although a little bit too bright, but that's what Amstrad does with its games. I also found that scrolling was pretty good too during stage 2. Impressive stuff all around, but again, annoyingly, we are limited to the smaller gameplay screen here. This was dependent on the modes that the programmer worked with, of course. Different Amstrad modes gave us different looks. Nevertheless, a really nice port which many would have been happy with back in the day. I remember buying this for my NES back in the day from a selling newspaper, as it were, known as Trade It, a West Country selling paper that is. Good lord, that paper was awesome, and there were a good way there to buy some second-hand games for a really good price. Anyways, I wasn't overly impressed with this version, but playing it again after all these years, I can say that it isn't actually that bad. Music is a nice NES rendition of the arcade music. I do find that the sprites have a strange way of moving in this part, almost like there's a second sprite moving slightly behind them. It's also a fairly tough version of Bad Dudes 2. Nice sound effects and even throws in some voice synth too, which I'd totally forgotten about. Sprites weren't as large as the arcade version, and there is a fair amount of flicker going on here. Like I say, I was thinking I might see the truck make an appearance, but with this 1989 Data East conversion, it was already parked, and I didn't get to see it drive by. The second stage looks fairly nice, but sadly, no cars were here, which was transporting ninjas. Overall, a fairly average NES side-scrolling beat-em-up game. The Atari ST conversion is a fairly faithful port, a little slow to play, but good to an extent. It certainly looks the part with larger sprites than previous versions we've looked at so far. The music and sound effects are okay, but the next conversion in this video is much better. It's fairly good to control, and goddammit, no truck rolling into the first stage with this version either. The magazines back in the day made it seem that this was a thing for each version. Really? Did the magazines lie to us? Nah, they wouldn't do that to kids, would they now? Really though, one of the things I was looking forward to was that moment in each version where it actually only happens in one conversion so far, which was the CPC. One thing that stands out with the SD version is that light grey border, but that's not the end of the world. It's a fairly good port, just a little slow. And in first place, I put the Commodore Amiga conversion, which also released back in 1988. It's a fairly solid conversion. The music compared with other versions for a start is more authentic to the original sound, and also the sound effects are pretty much smack on here too. It does play a tiny bit fast, but that could be down to WinUA that I was using. Although I did set this as a stock Amiga 500 model, and having looked at other gameplays of this Amiga port, they all pretty much look the same. same. I am thinking that this is how it actually looked originally back on release in the late 80s. This conversion plays really well and is very responsive to controls. I actually love the music here, and dare I say it, I think it's an upgrade from the arcades version. Color-wise isn't too bad compared with some other versions here. Collision detection is also pretty spot on here too. Sadly, no truck, and just like a couple of other conversions, we also had to wait a few seconds for the boss to load in. Second stage also looks really nice with nice consistent multi-scrolling action, which doesn't appear to lag. So that's it for my ranking Bad Dudes vs Dragon Ninja ports today. So which version did you grow up with? Are you like me and got brought up with the Commodore 64 conversion? Which version would you have put in first place? Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.
Got it. Got it.